In the unforgiving Arizona territory of 1877, where survival often meant choosing between self-preservation and human compassion, some acts of heroism transcended the harsh realities of frontier life. This is the extraordinary true story of Jake Sullivan, a battle-scarred Civil War veteran who had retreated to a remote ranch to escape the ghosts of his past, and the fateful day when the Gila River's fury would force him to make a choice that would change three lives forever. The Great Flood of May 1877 began with an atmospheric river of biblical proportions, following the same catastrophic pattern that had devastated the territory in 1862. But this time, the churning waters would carry more than debris and destruction. They would bring together two orphan sisters clinging to life and a lonely man who had forgotten what it meant to have something worth saving. As Mary and Sarah Williams fought for survival in the merciless current, Jake Sullivan faced the most important decision of his life: remain safely on shore and preserve the solitary existence he'd carefully built, or risk everything for two strangers whose fate now hung in the balance of his courage. The morning of May 15th, 1877, dawned with the deceptive calm that Arizona weather was notorious for. Jake Sullivan stood on the wraparound porch of his ranch house, a sturdy structure he'd built into the hillside 3 miles east of the Gila River, watching the gathering clouds with the practiced eye of a man who'd learned to read nature's warnings the hard way. At 32, Jake bore the weathered features of someone who'd seen too much war and chosen the isolation of frontier ranching to heal wounds that went deeper than the saber scar that traced his left temple from ear to jaw. The ranch itself was a testament to both his military engineering skills and his desire for solitude. Positioned on high ground with clear sight lines in all directions, it featured a main house, barn, and corrals built from local stone and timber, designed to withstand both Apache raids and the violent weather that periodically swept across the territory. Jake had chosen this location specifically because the Gila River's historical flood patterns, well documented since the Great Deluge of 1862, indicated that his elevated position would remain safe even during the worst possible conditions. His nearest neighbors were the Williams sisters, Mary and Sarah, who worked a small homestead in the river bottom 3 miles to the west. Jake had met them only twice in the 18 months since they'd arrived from back east. Brief encounters at the trading post in Safford when they were purchasing supplies with the careful frugality of people living on the margins of survival. Mary, the elder at 22, carried herself with the determined dignity of someone who'd accepted responsibility beyond her years, while 19-year-old Sarah possessed the kind of irrepressible optimism that frontier life hadn't yet managed to crush. The sisters had inherited their property from a distant uncle they'd never met, arriving in Arizona territory with little more than their late parents' savings and an unshakable belief that hard work could overcome any obstacle. Their homestead consisted of a modest adobe house, a small barn, and 20 acres of irrigated land that produced enough vegetables and grain to sustain them through careful management and relentless effort. They raised chickens, maintained a milk cow, and had even managed to establish a small orchard of fruit trees that were beginning to show promise. But their location in the fertile river bottom, while ideal for farming, placed them directly in the path of any major flood. Jake had noted this vulnerability during his infrequent trips to town, but the sisters' polite independence and his own preference for solitude had prevented him from offering advice about flood preparedness. He respected their privacy just as he guarded his own, understanding that people came to the Arizona territory for many reasons, most of which involved leaving something behind. As Jake watched the clouds building over the Mogollon Rim to the north, his experienced eye noted troubling signs. The cloud formations were stacking in ways that suggested massive atmospheric moisture, and the wind patterns reminded him uncomfortably of the conditions described by old-timers who'd survived the 1862 flood. More concerning was the unusual warmth of the morning air, which indicated that the substantial snowpack in the mountains was melting rapidly, adding millions of gallons of runoff to whatever rainfall might occur. His contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Tom Bradley, a grizzled prospector who served as the territory's unofficial weather prophet and bearer of news from the scattered homesteads and mining camps. Tom's weathered face carried an expression of deep concern as he dismounted from his mule near Jake's front porch. "Jake!" Tom called out, his voice carrying the urgency of a man who'd seen enough frontier disasters to recognize the warning signs. "You seen the river this morning? She's running higher than I've seen since '62, and that's before the rain even starts proper." Jake invited Tom inside for coffee, recognizing that the old prospector's visits always brought information worth hearing. As they settled at the kitchen table, Tom spread out a rough map he'd drawn showing current conditions at various points along the Gila River system. "Been riding the high country for 3 days," Tom explained, pointing to marked locations on his map. "Snow's melting faster than I've ever seen, and there's word from up north that they've had steady rain for a week. All that water's heading this way, and when it hits the river channel, it's going to be like nothing anybody's seen in 15 years. The implications were immediately clear to Jake. While his ranch would remain safe on its elevated position, anyone living in the river bottom would face potentially catastrophic flooding. His thoughts immediately turned to the Williams sisters, isolated in their adobe house with no neighbors close enough to provide immediate assistance. "What about the folks downstream?" Jake asked, though he already suspected the answer. Tom's expression grew grimmer. "That's what I'm worried about. Been trying to get word to everybody in the bottom land, but it's a big territory and not much time. Weather's moving fast, and when it hits, it's going to hit hard." As if summoned by their conversation, the first fat raindrops began spattering against the windows, each one carrying the promise of the deluge to come. Jake walked to the window and studied the rapidly darkening sky, his military training automatically calculating distances, timing, and logistics. If the flood hit with the force Tom was predicting, the Williams sisters would have perhaps hours to evacuate to higher ground, assuming they understood the danger and had somewhere to go. "I should ride over and warn them," Jake said, though he knew that by the time he saddled his horse and covered the 3 miles to their homestead, the weather might already be too dangerous for travel. Tom nodded approvingly. "Thought you might say that. Always figured you for the decent sort, despite all that business about wanting to be left alone." As Jake prepared to leave, Tom offered one final piece of advice that would prove prophetic. "Jake, when this storm hits, it's going to test everything. Buildings, bridges, and the character of every person in its path. Sometimes the difference between surviving and drowning ain't about being in the right place, but about being willing to do the right thing when the moment comes." The ride to the Williams homestead took Jake through increasingly treacherous conditions as the morning storm intensified into something approaching biblical proportions. Rain fell in sheets so thick he could barely see his horse's ears, and the wind carried the kind of raw power that suggested nature was unleashing forces that would reshape the landscape before the day was through. By the time he reached the river bottom, Jake could see that the normally placid Gila had already begun its transformation into something altogether more dangerous. What he found at the Williams homestead would haunt him for the rest of his life. The sisters' small adobe house sat empty, its door standing open to reveal clear signs of hasty evacuation. Personal belongings were scattered about, and muddy footprints led from the house toward the river, suggesting that Mary and Sarah had attempted to save their livestock when the initial flooding began. Their wagon was missing, along with their horse, indicating they'd tried to reach higher ground, but had been caught somewhere between their home and safety. Jake followed the muddy trail toward the river, his heart sinking as he realized what had likely happened. The sisters had probably been attempting to cross to higher ground when the flood surge hit, overwhelming their escape route and sweeping them into the churning waters that now raged through the valley with unstoppable force. Standing at the edge of what had once been a gentle stream, but was now a torrent of destruction, Jake faced the terrible possibility that 2 young women had already been claimed by the Gila River's fury, and that his warning had come too late to matter. Jake's worst fears seemed confirmed as he reached the swollen banks of the Gila River, now transformed from a gentle waterway into a raging monster that had swallowed bridges, uprooted massive cottonwoods, and turned the peaceful valley into a landscape of destruction. The roar of the water was deafening, punctuated by the crash of debris and the groaning of structures succumbing to forces they were never designed to withstand. Through the driving rain and spray, Jake could barely make out the opposite bank, now separated from him by nearly 200 yards of churning brown water. It was then, through the chaos of wind and rain, that he heard something that stopped his heart. a human voice calling for help, barely audible above the flood's roar, but unmistakably desperate. Shielding his eyes against the rain, Jake scanned the turbulent water until he spotted them. Two figures clinging to what appeared to be the remains of a wagon, swept along by the current about 100 yards downstream from where he stood. Even at that distance, Jake could see that the sisters were in mortal danger. Mary appeared to be supporting her younger sister, who seemed either injured or exhausted, while both fought to maintain their grip on the improvised raft that represented their only hope of survival. The wreckage was spinning slowly in the current, carrying them toward a bend in the river where massive boulders and fallen trees created a deadly obstacle course that would almost certainly claim their lives. Jake's military training immediately assessed the tactical situation with grim precision. The current was moving faster than a horse could run, making any attempt to parallel their movement along the bank futile. The river was too wide and violent for any conventional rescue attempt, and the debris in the water would make swimming suicidal for anyone attempting to reach them. By every rational calculation, the sisters were beyond help, and any attempt to save them would likely result in 3 deaths instead of 2. But even as his logical mind cataloged the impossibilities, Jake found himself untying his lariat from his saddle and scanning the riverbank for options. 3 years of solitary ranching hadn't entirely erased the instincts of a cavalry officer who'd made a career of finding solutions to impossible problems. His eyes fixed on a massive cottonwood that had fallen across the river during the initial flood surge, its trunk extending nearly 50 feet from the bank before disappearing into the torrent. The tree was positioned at the river's bend, approximately where the sisters would pass if they could maintain their grip on the wagon wreckage for another few minutes. If Jake could work his way out onto the fallen trunk and position himself with the rope, he might be able to intercept them as they swept past. The plan was desperate and dangerous, requiring split-second timing and extraordinary luck, but it represented the only chance any of them had. Without allowing himself time to reconsider, Jake secured one end of his 40-foot lariat to a sturdy boulder and began working his way along the fallen cottonwood's massive trunk. The bark was slick with rain and river spray, and the tree groaned ominously under the combined assault of his weight and the flood's pressure. Each step required careful placement and absolute focus, as a single slip would send him into the same deadly current that threatened the sisters. As he worked his way toward the tree's end, Jake could hear Mary's voice more clearly, shouting encouragement to her sister while fighting to maintain their precarious position on the disintegrating wagon. The vehicle was coming apart piece by piece, shedding boards and wheels as it spun through the flood, leaving the sisters with an increasingly unstable platform that might collapse completely at any moment. "Hold on!" Jake shouted, though he doubted they could hear him over the water's roar. "I'm coming for you!" The reply came back faintly but clearly, Mary's voice carrying the kind of desperate hope that could sustain people through the worst imaginable circumstances. "We see you." Sarah's hurt, but we're holding on. Jake reached the end of the fallen tree just as the wagon wreckage swept into range, spinning lazily in the current, with both sisters clinging to what remained of the wagon bed. Up close, he could see that Sarah appeared to be unconscious, or nearly so, her head resting against her sister's shoulder, while Mary maintained a death grip on both the wagon and her sibling. Blood streaked Sarah's face from a head wound, and her skin had the pale cast that suggested serious injury or shock. The timing would have to be perfect. Jake positioned himself at the tree's end, rope in hand, calculating angles and distances with the precision that had once made him an effective artillery officer. He would have one chance, perhaps 2 at most, before the current carried the sisters beyond his reach forever. As the wagon debris swept toward him, Jake could see Mary's eyes lock onto his, her expression mixing desperate hope with the grim determination of someone who refused to surrender despite impossible odds. She had somehow managed to keep both herself and her unconscious sister alive through conditions that should have claimed them both, demonstrating the kind of courage that reminded Jake why some things were worth risking everything to preserve. "When I throw the rope, grab it and hold on no matter what," Jake shouted. "Don't try to tie it. Just hold on and trust me." The wagon passed beneath him in a rush of spray and debris, close enough that Jake could smell the river mud and see the exhaustion etched in Mary's features. His lariat snaked out in a perfect arc, the loop settling around Mary's shoulders just as she reached up to grab it. The rope went taut with a jolt that nearly pulled Jake from his precarious perch, but his grip held, and suddenly he was connected to two lives that depended entirely on his strength and determination. The physics of the situation were brutal. The flood's power was attempting to tear the sisters away from the wagon wreckage while simultaneously threatening to drag Jake from the tree. Mary's weight, combined with her sister's, created a strain on the rope that tested both the fibers and Jake's ability to maintain his position. His hands burned as the rope cut into his palms, and his shoulders ached with the effort of supporting two people against the full force of the Gila River flood. But Jake had endured worse during the war, and the sisters' lives provided motivation that mere survival had never offered. Hand over hand, he began pulling them toward the relative safety of the fallen tree, each foot of progress requiring enormous effort and careful coordination. Mary helped as much as she could, using her free arm to propel herself and her sister through the water, while maintaining her grip on both the rope and Sarah. The rescue seemed to take hours, though it could have been no more than minutes before Mary's hands found purchase on the tree trunk. Together, she and Jake managed to pull the unconscious Sarah from the water, positioning her across the broad trunk, where she would be safe from the flood's immediate threat. Only then did Jake allow himself to believe that they might all survive the next few minutes. "Is she breathing?" Jake asked, studying Sarah's pale features with concern. Mary nodded, her voice hoarse from shouting over the flood's roar. "She hit her head when the wagon overturned, but she's been conscious until just now. I think she's just exhausted and hurt, not—" She couldn't bring herself to finish the sentence. "We need to get to shore," Jake said, assessing their position. "This tree won't hold forever, and the water's still rising." The journey back along the trunk proved even more challenging than the outward trip, with Jake supporting Sarah's unconscious form while Mary followed close behind. Each step was a calculated risk as the tree continued to shift under the flood's pressure. But they managed to reach solid ground just as the cottonwood's root system finally gave way, sending the massive trunk spinning downstream in a display of the forces they had barely escaped. As Jake carried Sarah toward higher ground, with Mary walking beside them on unsteady legs, he realized that his solitary existence had just become considerably more complicated. Two young women now depended on his help for their immediate survival, and the flood that had brought them together showed no signs of abating anytime soon. His isolated ranch would become their refuge, at least temporarily, and Jake found himself contemplating responsibilities he'd avoided for 3 years of careful solitude. But as he looked down at Sarah's peaceful face and caught Mary's grateful expression, Jake discovered that the prospect of company didn't fill him with the dread he'd expected. Perhaps some kinds of solitude were simply another form of cowardice, and perhaps some rescues saved more than just the people being pulled from the water. Jake's ranch house had never sheltered anyone but himself and the occasional overnight guest. But as he carried the unconscious Sarah across the threshold with Mary close behind, the sturdy room seemed to expand with possibility. The main living area, with its massive stone fireplace and hand-hewn furniture, provided the kind of warmth and security that the sisters desperately needed after their ordeal in the flood. Jake immediately set about building up the fire, while Mary tended to her sister, displaying the kind of practiced competence that spoke of experience caring for others. "She needs to get out of these wet clothes," Mary said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that marked her features. "And that head wound should be cleaned and bandaged." Jake nodded, directing Mary to the spare bedroom, where he kept clean linens and basic medical supplies left over from his army days. As a former cavalry officer, he'd learned field medicine out of necessity, and his kit included bandages, antiseptic, and pain medication that would help Sarah's recovery. More importantly, his isolation had taught him the value of maintaining substantial emergency supplies, including women's clothing that he'd purchased for trade but never used. While Mary worked to make her sister comfortable, Jake busied himself with practical preparations for extended guests. The flood showed no signs of abating, and even when the waters receded, it would likely be days before travel became safe enough for the sisters to consider returning to their homestead, assuming anything remained to return to. Jake found himself oddly pleased by the prospect of company, despite 3 years of deliberately cultivating solitude. Sarah regained consciousness near midnight, her dark eyes focusing slowly on unfamiliar surroundings before settling on her sister's relieved face. The head wound that had rendered her unconscious proved to be more dramatic than dangerous, requiring several stitches but showing no signs of serious brain injury. Her first words were characteristic of the determination that had enabled both sisters to survive in frontier Arizona. "Did we lose everything?" Sarah asked, her voice weak but clear. Mary's expression answered the question before she spoke. "The house might be gone, and most of our things, but we're alive, and that's what matters. This is Mr. Sullivan. He pulled us from the river." Sarah turned grateful eyes toward Jake, who was maintaining a respectful distance while ensuring the fire provided adequate warmth. "Thank you," she said simply, the words carrying more weight than elaborate speeches could have conveyed. Over the following days, as the flood gradually receded and normal weather returned to the territory, the three refugees settled into an unexpected domestic routine. Mary proved to be an excellent cook who could transform Jake's basic supplies into meals that reminded him why he'd once enjoyed sharing food with others. Sarah, despite her injury, insisted on helping with household tasks as soon as she was able, displaying the kind of cheerful industriousness that made even mundane chores seem purposeful. Jake found himself rediscovering the pleasure of conversation, something he'd avoided during his years of self-imposed isolation. Mary possessed a sharp intelligence and dry sense of humor that made her an engaging companion, while Sarah's optimistic outlook provided a refreshing contrast to the cynicism that frontier life often fostered. Both sisters treated him with the kind of respectful friendliness that indicated genuine appreciation without presuming upon his hospitality. On the third day after the rescue, when Sarah was strong enough for extended conversation, Jake learned more about the circumstances that had brought the sisters to Arizona territory. Their parents had died in a typhoid epidemic that swept through their Ohio town the previous year, leaving them with limited resources and no close relatives willing to take responsibility for two adult women. The inheritance of their uncle's Arizona homestead had represented their only chance for independence and security. "We knew it would be difficult," Mary explained as they sat on the porch watching the morning sun dry the last evidence of the flood from the landscape. "But we thought if we worked hard and were careful with money, we could make a success of it. The land was fertile, and we'd started to build something worthwhile." Jake had ridden out that morning to assess the damage to their property, returning with news that was mixed at best. The adobe house had partially collapsed, taking most of their personal belongings with it, but the barn had survived, and some of their livestock had been found alive several miles downstream. Most devastating was the loss of their wagon and horse, which had provided their only transportation and connection to the outside world. "It could be rebuilt," Jake said carefully, not wanting to offer false hope, but recognizing the sisters' need for honest assessment. "The foundation is solid, and adobe construction can be repaired if you're willing to put in the work, but it would take time and resources that might be difficult to manage." Sarah's response revealed the resilience that had enabled both sisters to survive their parents' deaths and establish themselves in the Arizona wilderness. "We've started over before. As long as we're together and healthy, we can do it again." But Jake had been thinking about alternatives that might benefit all three of them. His ranch was larger than one man needed, and the sisters' domestic skills complemented his own agricultural and ranching expertise. More importantly, he'd discovered that their company had begun to fill spaces in his life that he'd convinced himself were better left empty. "There's another possibility," he said, choosing his words carefully. "This ranch is too big for one person and too isolated for safety during emergencies like floods. If you were interested in a partnership arrangement, there's plenty of room for separate living quarters and enough land for multiple enterprises." Mary studied his face with the shrewd assessment of someone who'd learned to evaluate propositions carefully. "What kind of partnership?" "Practical," Jake replied. "You bring domestic management, farming expertise, and additional labor. I contribute land, livestock, and construction skills. We share expenses and profits according to contribution, and everyone maintains their independence while benefiting from cooperation." The conversation continued over several days as the sisters considered options and Jake refined his proposal. What emerged was an arrangement that promised mutual benefit while respecting everyone's autonomy. The sisters would establish their own household in a separate wing of the ranch house, contributing their domestic and agricultural skills while maintaining their financial independence through shared profits from expanded farming operations. But beneath the practical discussions, other currents were flowing that would complicate the straightforward business arrangement they were negotiating. Jake found himself increasingly drawn to Mary's combination of strength and vulnerability, while Mary seemed to appreciate his respectful treatment and genuine concern for both sisters' welfare. Sarah, observing these developments with the perceptiveness of someone who'd grown up watching her older sister sacrifice personal happiness for family responsibilities, began to encourage a relationship that might provide security and affection for all of them. The transformation from rescue to partnership seemed natural and inevitable, but Jake knew that frontier life rarely allowed for simple solutions to complex human needs. The Arizona Territory in 1877 was a place where survival required constant vigilance, and where the bonds between people were tested by forces that could destroy the unwary or unprepared. As he watched Mary and Sarah begin to establish themselves in their new home, Jake realized that saving them from the flood had been only the beginning of a much longer and more complicated rescue, one that would require all three of them to save each other from the loneliness and dangers that threatened anyone trying to build a life in the wilderness. The partnership they were creating would face challenges that went far beyond practical arrangements and shared expenses. But as Jake sat on his porch in the evening, listening to the sisters' voices as they planned improvements to their shared home, he dared to hope that perhaps the best rescues were the ones that saved everyone involved. 3 weeks after the flood, the transformed routine at Jake's ranch had settled into a rhythm that felt both natural and revolutionary. The separate wing that Jake had hastily constructed for the sisters provided them with privacy and independence while keeping them close enough for easy cooperation and shared meals. Mary had proven herself an exceptional manager of domestic affairs, organizing everything from food storage to laundry with an efficiency that freed Jake to focus on expanding the ranch's operations. Sarah, despite her youth, demonstrated remarkable skill with both animals and plants, establishing a garden that promised to provide fresh vegetables throughout the growing season. But the comfortable domesticity was complicated by undercurrents of attraction and affection that none of them had anticipated when they negotiated their practical partnership. Jake found himself looking forward to Mary's company with an intensity that went far beyond appreciation for her household management skills. Their evening conversations on the porch had become the highlight of his days, revealing a woman whose intelligence and strength were matched by a gentle vulnerability that she rarely allowed others to see. Mary, for her part, had begun to appreciate Jake's combination of masculine competence and emotional sensitivity. Unlike many frontier men who viewed women as either helpmates or burdens, Jake treated both sisters as equal partners whose opinions and contributions were valued. His respect for their independence, combined with his obvious protectiveness, created exactly the kind of security that Mary had been seeking since their parents' deaths. Sarah observed these developing feelings with satisfaction and strategic thinking. Her near-death experience in the flood had clarified her priorities, and she recognized that her sister's happiness was essential to her own. More practically, she understood that a genuine romantic attachment between Jake and Mary would cement the partnership that provided all three of them with security and purpose. Her role became that of a diplomatic facilitator, creating opportunities for private conversation while ensuring that her presence never became an obstacle to the relationship's development. The first test of their new arrangement came when Tom Bradley arrived with news from the outside world. The old prospector's expression was troubled as he dismounted near the ranch house, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by obvious concern. "Jake," Tom called out, "we got problems brewing that you need to know about. Word's getting around about you taking in those sisters, and not everybody's happy about the situation." The news concerned gossip that had begun circulating in Safford and the surrounding settlements. Some residents questioned the propriety of two unmarried women living at a bachelor's ranch, while others suggested that Jake was taking advantage of the sisters' desperate circumstances for his own benefit. Most troubling were rumors that the Williams sisters might be claiming resources or land rights that belonged to other parties. It's mostly just talk, Tom explained as they gathered around the kitchen table. But there's a few folks who seem determined to make trouble. Preacher Johnson's been saying that decent women wouldn't put themselves in such a compromising situation, and there's talk that maybe the territory should investigate the whole arrangement. Mary's face flushed with anger at the implications, but her response demonstrated the dignity that had impressed Jake from their first meeting. Mr. Bradley, we're grateful for the warning. Are there specific concerns we should address, or is this simply malicious gossip? Tom's admiration for Mary's direct approach was evident in his reply. Ma'am, most folks understand that you were rescued from floodwaters and needed help. The problem is with people who can't mind their own business and maybe see opportunity in causing trouble for others. Jake's military training immediately assessed the situation as a potential threat requiring strategic response. Frontier communities were often quick to judge situations that didn't conform to conventional expectations, and isolated ranchers who attracted negative attention could find themselves facing everything from social ostracism to actual legal challenges. What do you recommend? Jake asked, recognizing Tom's value as someone who understood local politics and social dynamics. Well, Tom said thoughtfully, most of the talk would stop if the situation was more official. Married folks don't generate the same kind of speculation as unmarried ones living under the same roof. The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace, obvious but unspoken until that moment. Jake and Mary exchanged glances that conveyed volumes of unspoken communication, while Sarah maintained carefully neutral expression that didn't quite hide her satisfaction with the direction of the conversation. That's certainly one solution, Mary said carefully, her voice steady despite the emotional significance of the topic. But marriage should be based on more than social convenience. Jake stood and walked to the window, ostensibly studying the landscape but actually gathering courage for words he'd been considering for days. Mary, he said without turning around, what if it wasn't just convenience? What if it was something we both wanted for reasons that have nothing to do with other people's opinions? The silence that followed contained the weight of decisions that would reshape all their lives. When Mary finally spoke, her voice carried the same quiet strength that had sustained her through their parents' deaths and the flood's devastation. Jake Sullivan, she said, are you asking me to marry you? Jake turned to face her, his expression serious but hopeful. I'm asking if you'd consider it, not because of gossip or social pressure, but because I've come to care about you in ways I hadn't expected, and because I think we could build something together that would be stronger than what any of us could manage alone. Mary's reply came after a moment's consideration, but her smile indicated that the decision had been made with her heart as well as her head. Yes, she said simply, I think we could build something wonderful together. Sarah's delighted laughter broke the tension, and even Tom Bradley's weathered features showed approval of the romantic development he'd inadvertently encouraged. The practical partnership that had emerged from flood rescue was evolving into something deeper and more permanent, creating the foundation for a family that none of them had originally planned, but all had come to value. But even as they celebrated the engagement, Jake remained aware that frontier life had a way of testing the strongest commitments. The gossip Tom had reported was likely just the beginning of challenges that would require all their combined strength to overcome. Marriage would provide social respectability, but it would also create new responsibilities and vulnerabilities that they would have to navigate together. As the evening progressed and Tom shared news from other parts of the territory, Jake found himself studying Mary's profile in the firelight and marveling at the journey that had brought them to this moment. 3 weeks earlier, she'd been a stranger clinging to wreckage in floodwaters. Now she was preparing to become his wife and partner in building a life that neither of them could have imagined when they'd begun this day as rescuer and rescued. The transformation seemed miraculous, but Jake understood that the real work was just beginning. Marriage in the Arizona territory required not just love and commitment, but the kind of practical cooperation that could overcome isolation, danger, and the countless challenges that faced anyone trying to create stability in an untamed land. The wedding took place on a warm June morning in the makeshift chapel that Safford's residents had constructed for community gatherings. Despite the gossip that had precipitated their decision to marry, Jake and Mary found themselves surrounded by neighbors who had come to celebrate rather than criticize. Tom Bradley served as Jake's best man, while Sarah stood proudly beside her sister as maid of honor, wearing a blue dress that had been her mother's and radiated happiness that was impossible to ignore. The ceremony itself was simple but meaningful, with Reverend Patterson performing a service that emphasized the practical virtues of marriage on the frontier, while acknowledging the genuine affection that was evident between bride and groom. Jake had traded his usual work clothes for a suit that had seen service during his military days, while Mary wore a white dress that Sarah had sewn from fabric purchased with their carefully hoarded savings. The exchange of vows felt both formal and intimate, marking not just a legal union, but the culmination of feelings that had grown from mutual respect into genuine love. Following the ceremony, the newlyweds and Sarah returned to the ranch to begin their married life with the kind of celebration that frontier circumstances allowed. Jake had prepared a special dinner featuring fresh beef from their herd and vegetables from Sarah's garden, while Mary had somehow managed to create a wedding cake despite the limitations of a wood-burning stove and basic ingredients. The three of them sat on the porch as evening fell, sharing food and conversation that felt both ceremonial and comfortable. But their domestic happiness was interrupted the following week by visitors whose intentions proved far less benevolent than those of the wedding guests. Three men arrived at the ranch during the afternoon when Jake was working in the distant pastures and the sisters were alone at the house. Their leader, a heavy-set man named Briggs who introduced himself as a representative of the Territorial Land Office, claimed to be investigating irregularities in property ownership that had come to his agency's attention. "We've received complaints," Briggs announced without dismounting from his horse, "that this property is being used for purposes that violate territorial homestead regulations. Specifically, that multiple unmarried persons were establishing unlawful claims through fraudulent cohabitation." Mary faced the visitors with the calm dignity that had characterized her response to every crisis since Jake had known her. "Sir, my husband and I are legally married residents of this property, which Mr. Sullivan owns through legitimate purchase. My sister is our guest. I'm not aware of any regulations that have been violated." Briggs's two companions, rough men whose bearing suggested more familiarity with violence than law enforcement, exchanged glances that indicated they had expected a different response. It became clear that they had arrived expecting to find the unmarried arrangement that had generated gossip weeks earlier, and Mary's reference to her husband had disrupted whatever plan they had been implementing. "Marriage records can be verified," Briggs said, though his tone suggested disappointment rather than satisfaction with this information. "But there are other concerns about how this property was acquired and whether proper procedures were followed." Sarah, observing from the porch, had quietly moved to a position where she could access the rifle that Jake kept loaded near the front door. Her movement was subtle but purposeful, indicating that despite her youth and gentle demeanor, she understood that their visitors represented a potential threat requiring careful management. "Mr. Briggs," Mary said, maintaining her composure despite the obvious tension, "my husband will return shortly, and he can provide you with any documentation you require. All our land transactions have been conducted through proper legal channels." But Briggs seemed less interested in documentation than in intimidation. His examination of the ranch's buildings and improvements had the calculating quality of someone assessing value rather than investigating legal compliance. More troubling was the way his companions positioned themselves to control potential escape routes, suggesting that their visit might have purposes beyond official inquiry. The situation remained balanced on the edge of confrontation when Jake appeared on horseback, having been alerted to the visitors' presence by their horses' tracks near the river. His approach was casual but alert, and his hand rested near the Colt revolver that he'd worn throughout his years of frontier ranching. The sight of armed strangers questioning his wife had triggered instincts that 3 years of peaceful isolation hadn't entirely suppressed. "Gentlemen," Jake said as he dismounted, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command, "I'm Jake Sullivan, owner of this property. How can I help you?" Briggs repeated his claims about territorial investigation, but his explanation sounded less convincing when delivered to an armed man who was clearly prepared to defend his property and family. Jake's military bearing and obvious competence with weapons had shifted the dynamic of the encounter, forcing the visitors to reconsider whatever plans they had been developing. "I'd be happy to review any official documentation you have," Jake said, his tone polite but firm. and to provide you with copies of my property deeds, which were filed with the territorial government and are completely legitimate. The confrontation might have escalated beyond words if not for the arrival of an unexpected ally. Sheriff Morrison from Safford appeared on the horizon, riding hard toward the ranch with the urgency of someone responding to a reported emergency. His presence immediately changed the character of the encounter, as legitimate law enforcement arrived to witness whatever Briggs and his companions had been planning. "Jake," Sheriff Morrison called out as he approached, "Tom Bradley sent word that you might be having visitors of the unwelcome variety. Everything all right here?" The sheriff's intervention revealed that Tom's network of contacts had been monitoring suspicious activities throughout the territory. Briggs and his companions were apparently known to Morrison as men who used fraudulent legal claims to extort money from isolated ranchers, particularly those whose circumstances made them vulnerable to accusations of impropriety. "These gentlemen claim to represent the Territorial Land Office," and Jake explained, "but they haven't provided any official documentation of their authority." Sheriff Morrison's examination of Briggs's credentials was brief and conclusive. "Mr. Briggs," he said with obvious satisfaction, "you're operating with forged papers and impersonating territorial officials. That's a felony under Arizona law." The attempted extortion collapsed rapidly as the fake officials found themselves facing arrest rather than collecting money from intimidated victims. Briggs and his companions were escorted to Safford for prosecution, while Jake and Mary were left to contemplate how quickly their peaceful domestic life could be threatened by forces beyond their control. "This won't be the last time," Sheriff Morrison warned before departing. "Word's getting around that you folks have built something successful here, and that always attracts the wrong kind of attention. You might want to consider ways to make yourselves less vulnerable to this kind of harassment." The warning proved prophetic sooner than anyone expected. Less than a week after Briggs's arrest, the ranch was approached by a group of genuine threats whose intentions were far more dangerous than fraudulent legal documents. A band of rustlers, led by a man named Calhoun who had been operating throughout the territory, had apparently decided that Jake's isolated ranch represented an easy target for theft and worse. Unlike Briggs's bumbling attempt at legal intimidation, Calhoun's men were experienced criminals who understood the use of violence. They arrived at dawn when Jake was in the barn tending to the horses, and Mary and Sarah were preparing breakfast in the kitchen. The attackers' plan was evidently to overwhelm the ranch's defenses before organized resistance could develop. But they had underestimated both the ranch's defensive preparations and the courage of its inhabitants. Jake had learned from his encounter with Briggs that his isolated location made him vulnerable to various forms of attack, and he had taken steps to improve the ranch's security. More importantly, both Mary and Sarah had been practicing with firearms, understanding that frontier life required everyone to be prepared for violence. The battle that followed tested every bond that had been forged between the three members of their improvised family. Jake fought with the tactical skill of a cavalry officer, using the ranch's layout to create defensive advantages while minimizing the attackers' numerical superiority. Mary proved herself capable of deadly accuracy with a rifle, while Sarah demonstrated the kind of calm courage under fire that marked her as her sister's equal in all the qualities that mattered for survival. The confrontation ended when Sheriff Morrison arrived with a posse, having been alerted by gunfire that could be heard for miles across the territory. 3 of Calhoun's men were dead, 2 were wounded and captured, and Calhoun himself had fled toward Mexico with the remainder of his gang. The victory had been complete, but it had also demonstrated the ongoing dangers that faced anyone trying to build a peaceful life in Arizona territory. As Jake surveyed the damage to his property and reflected on how close they had come to losing everything, he realized that the bonds forged during the flood rescue had been tested and strengthened by combat. Mary had fought beside him with the kind of partnership that went far beyond their marriage vows, while Sarah had proven herself worthy of the family name through courage that would have impressed their late parents. "We did it," Mary said as they stood together, surveying their defended home. "All of us, together." Jake nodded, understanding that their victory represented more than successful defense against criminal attack. They had proven that the family they had created could survive the worst threats that frontier life could offer, and that the rescue that had begun in floodwaters had evolved into something strong enough to overcome any challenge. 6 months after the gunfight that had tested their bonds, The Sullivan Ranch had become something none of them had originally envisioned, but all had come to treasure beyond measure. The autumn of 1877 brought not just the changing colors of the Arizona high country, but also the news that Mary was expecting their first child. The announcement transformed their practical partnership into something deeper and more permanent, creating the final link in a family chain that had been forged through rescue, strengthened by mutual respect, and tempered by shared danger. Jake stood on the porch that had become his favorite place for contemplating the changes in his life, watching Sarah work with the horses in the corral, while Mary tended to the garden that now provided food for their growing household. The sight filled him with a contentment that his years of solitary ranching had never approached. The woman he had pulled from floodwaters had become not just his wife, but his partner in creating something that would outlast both their individual lives. The ranch itself reflected their combined efforts and shared vision. Jake's original buildings had been expanded to include proper quarters for Sarah, a workshop where Mary could pursue her sewing and domestic crafts, and additional barns to house the livestock that represented their growing prosperity. The garden that Sarah had started during her recovery had evolved into an agricultural operation that provided fresh produce to several families in the area, creating income that complemented the ranch's cattle operations. But more important than physical improvements was the transformation in all three members of their improvised family. Jake had rediscovered the pleasure of companionship and purpose beyond mere survival, finding in Mary and Sarah the kind of family bonds that his war experiences had convinced him were impossible to maintain. His military skills had found peaceful application in protecting and providing for people he loved, while his leadership abilities had been channeled into building rather than destroying. Mary had found in marriage to Jake not just security, but genuine partnership with a man who valued her intelligence and independence. Their relationship had evolved beyond the mutual respect that had characterized their early interactions into the kind of deep affection that made daily cooperation a pleasure rather than a duty. The prospect of motherhood added another dimension to her happiness, promising to fulfill dreams that she had set aside during the years of caring for Sarah alone. Sarah had grown from a dependent younger sister into a capable young woman whose contributions to the ranch were essential to its success. Her skill with animals had developed into genuine expertise that impressed even experienced ranchers, while her optimistic outlook had helped all three of them maintain perspective during the challenges they had faced. At 20, she was beginning to attract attention from eligible men in the area, but her loyalty to the family that had saved and sustained her remained absolute. The transformation was perhaps most evident in the way they handled the ongoing challenges that frontier life presented. When rustlers threatened their cattle, all three responded with coordinated efficiency that reflected months of preparation and mutual trust. When drought threatened their crops, they worked together to implement conservation measures that preserved both livestock and agricultural operations. When Sarah fell seriously ill with pneumonia during the early winter, Jake and Mary nursed her back to health with the kind of devoted care that biological families provided their own members. But the most significant test of their family bonds came with the arrival of spring and news that would challenge their carefully built security. A severe drought had begun affecting the entire territory, threatening not just their agricultural operations, but the very survival of their ranch. The spring rains that usually replenished the Gila River and filled their wells failed to materialize, leaving them facing the prospect of losing everything they had worked so hard to build. The drought's effects were visible everywhere Jake looked. The pastures that had been green and lush the previous year were now brown and brittle, forcing him to move their cattle to increasingly distant areas in search of adequate grazing. The garden that Sarah had so carefully cultivated was struggling despite their efforts to conserve water, and the well that had never failed them was dropping to dangerously low levels. "We need to make some hard decisions," Jake said during one of their evening planning sessions. "The cattle can't survive another month without better pasture, and we're going to have to choose between keeping the herd and maintaining enough water for the household." Mary studied the account books with the careful attention that had made her such an effective partner in managing their finances. "If we sell half the herd now, we might have enough money to last through the drought and enough water to keep the remaining cattle alive. But it would mean starting over if we're wrong about when the rains return." Sarah, whose connection to the land had proven as reliable as any farmer in the territory, offered her assessment with characteristic optimism tempered by realistic observation. The old-timers say droughts like this can last 2 years or more. If we're going to survive it, we need to think like we're planning for the long term, not just hoping for quick relief. The conversation continued through several difficult evenings as they weighed options that all involved significant risk and sacrifice. The drought was testing not just their practical resources, but their ability to make collective decisions that would affect all their futures. Unlike the immediate dangers they had faced from criminals and natural disasters, this challenge required sustained cooperation and mutual sacrifice over an extended period. Their solution emerged gradually through careful planning and shared commitment to their family's survival. They would reduce their herd to a sustainable size, implement strict water conservation measures, and diversify their income through Mary's sewing skills and Sarah's reputation for training horses. Most importantly, they would face the challenge together, supporting each other through the hardships that lay ahead. "We've survived worse than drought," Mary said as they finalized their plans. "We survived that flood by working together, and we'll survive this the same way." Jake nodded, understanding that she was right about more than their practical prospects. The bonds that had been forged during the flood rescue and strengthened through subsequent challenges were now strong enough to withstand even the slow, grinding pressure of economic hardship and environmental stress. The conversation was interrupted by Sarah's excited call from the barn, where she had discovered that their prize mare had given birth to twin foals during the night. The sight of the new life that had emerged from their care and planning provided a perfect metaphor for everything they had accomplished together. Like the foals, their family had been born from circumstances beyond anyone's control, but had thrived through careful nurturing and mutual protection. As summer approached, bringing with it the promise of their first child and continued prosperity for the ranch, Jake often found himself marveling at the journey that had brought them to this point. The man who had reluctantly pulled two strangers from floodwaters had discovered that rescue was a mutual process. Saving others had ultimately saved himself from the isolation that had been slowly destroying his capacity for joy and connection. Mary's pregnancy progressed without complications, aided by Sarah's devoted assistance and Jake's careful attention to ensuring she had everything needed for her health and comfort. Their first child, a daughter they named Hope, in honor of the optimism that had sustained them through every challenge, was born in November during the first snowfall of winter. The sight of his daughter sleeping peacefully in Mary's arms, while Sarah helped with the countless tasks that new babies required, filled Jake with a sense of completion that he had never imagined possible. As 1877 drew to a close, the Sullivan Ranch had become more than a successful agricultural operation. It had become the foundation for a family that would influence the Arizona Territory for generations to come. The rescue that had begun with desperate voices calling for help from floodwaters had evolved into something that rescued everyone involved, creating bonds that were stronger than blood and more enduring than the challenging circumstances that had forged them. Jake stood on his porch on Christmas Eve, holding his daughter while Mary and Sarah prepared the kind of celebration that turned a house into a home. The sight of the two women who had transformed his life working together in the warm glow of lamplight reminded him daily that the best rescues were the ones that saved everyone involved, and that sometimes the most extraordinary families were created by the simple decision to help strangers in distress. The flood that had brought them together was now just a memory, but the love and loyalty it had generated would flow forward like a river, nourishing everything it touched for as long as any of them lived, to remember the day when three strangers had become a family through courage, compassion, and the recognition that some bonds transcended every difference of background or circumstance. As winter settled over the Arizona Territory and the Sullivan Ranch glowed with the warmth of a family united by love and tested by adversity, their story became legend throughout the scattered communities of the frontier. Travelers carrying news between settlements would speak of the rancher who had risked everything to save two sisters from floodwaters, and how that single act of courage had created a family whose bonds were stronger than blood, and whose prosperity had grown from mutual respect and shared sacrifice. The rescue that had begun with desperate cries for help in the raging Gila River had become something far greater than anyone could have imagined. Jake Sullivan had not only saved Mary and Sarah Williams from drowning, he had saved himself from a life of lonely isolation that was slowly destroying his capacity for joy and connection. Mary had found not just a husband, but a true partner who valued her strength and intelligence. Sarah had gained not just a home, but a brother whose protection and affection would last a lifetime. Their story reminds us that the most meaningful families are often created not by accident of birth, but by the conscious choice to care for others when circumstances demand courage and compassion. In a world where it's easy to pass by strangers in distress, the Sullivans prove that sometimes the greatest gift we can give ourselves is the decision to help someone else, not knowing that in saving them, we might discover exactly what we've been missing in our own lives. Tell us in the comments below. Have you ever experienced a moment when helping a stranger changed your own life in ways you never expected? Have you witnessed the kind of courage that Jake showed when everything seemed impossible? We love hearing from viewers around the world who understand that sometimes the most extraordinary families are born from the most ordinary acts of human kindness. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more incredible true stories that will restore your faith in the power of love, courage, and the bonds that make us family. Tomorrow we have another amazing tale that will remind you why taking risks for others is always worth it.